Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you a book review from the HorrorLand series. And today we're going to be pulling a book from the Arc 2 from books 13 through 19 of the HorrorLand series, and we're going to be discussing book number 15, Heads You Lose. Now, a little bit of discourse before we go any further. The reason why I chose a random starting point with Arc 2 is because I heard that the Jonathan Chiller arc, aka Arc 2 of HorrorLand, isn't as important on where you start. If you're starting between books 13 through 18, you're fine. As long as you read 19 last, that's what I've heard, you'll be alright. So I decided to start here on this book, only because this book I've seen relative hype from people I trust in the community, and also with an IRL friend. An IRL friend said that this is one of their favorite Goosebumps books they've read. G King has been recommending this book to me. If you're out there watching, you have been recommending this book to me for quite some time, and you've stated a couple times to me that you think I would like this more than The Headless Ghost and A Night in Terror Tower. And then, of course, Michael Goosebumps fan has a review where he gave this book a 5 out of 5. And so, while I trust all three of the people who gave me information about this book, I went into this book kind of with expectations, trusting their judgments and stuff. And it's one of those situations where I let people's influence get to me a little bit before reading a book. And yeah, if it doesn't match what I'm trying to say now, I'm going to explicitly say that this book did not meet the hype I had in my mind of it. But I do think this is a great modern Goosebumps book. I am kind of glad I started here with Arc 2, only because I love how much this book is a love letter to the two books it's trying to combine. It's trying to combine The Headless Ghost and A Night in Terror Tower. And at the heart of it, I can appreciate it for that because it brings so much nostalgia for me. And I really, really enjoy this book. Not only for that, but for how dark it gets, for how some of the ironic humor gets, and for how inventive some of these characters come off and feel, despite it coming off like a merging of two books that came before it. It has a lot of originality going for it, has a lot of cool things, I think, that can carry the story's legacy forward. But for me, I do have issues with it, and I'll get to that near the end. But this book surprisingly gets a recommend from me. And if you have not read Heads You Lose, I highly recommend it. It's a pretty different feeling one, all said and done, in my opinion. So let's get into the plot overview without giving too much away. So in Arc 2, from what I gathered from this book, the first couple of chapters of Arc 2 HorrorLand books start out with the protagonists and whoever else is going to be in the main story here are in Horrorland, and they somehow come across items that they take home, and then they experience these items and have this story. And then somehow Jonathan Chiller, who is the Arc 2 main bad guy, as we'll see in book 19, which I'm kind of getting way ahead of myself because I've only done one Arc 2 book. But eventually they all come, supposedly, and meet up with Jonathan Chiller in book 19. So this book is a pretty decent start to that. And it kind of showcases some things in Arc 2 that I'm pretty much going to expect to see moving forward as I read these books. So the two characters in this book are named Jessica and Ryan. Jessica is the main protagonist, and Jessica and Ryan are in Horrorland. They're in Horrorland visiting the park, and Jessica gives some background information about her and her friend Ryan, and that they're big magic nerds, which I've already kind of said my gripes in the past about magic-centered Goosebumps books. I think they're kind of outdated and not really popular these days, but it is kind of seeing a comeback with like Game of Thrones, and Harry Potter's still popular, so I can kind of understand why people are still into magic in some regards. But here, it's kind of more in the vein of classical magic, as Jessica and Ryan have grown up being friends since early childhood, and they bond over having these experiences with Jessica's father, who is this birthday party magician who does like 3 or 4 birthday parties a week. And Jessica and Ryan have learned many tricks and trades from Jessica's father, like how to talk with a ventriloquist voice and project their voice into different parts of the room, and they've learned how to pickpocket and misdirect people like magicians do. And while they're in Horrorland, Jessica and Ryan have heard of this magician that's going to be there named Mondo, And Mondo is supposed to be this really great magician. They can't wait to see their show. And on top of that, there's this magic shop in HorrorLand they want to visit to see if they can find any cool items that they can bring home to improve their own magic acts. So before they go get prepared to see Mondo's magic show, they enter this magic shop and they're playing around with these trinkets inside of this shop, and they all seem kind of weird. And then they bump into Mondo. And Mondo is this magician guy, and, you know, I don't know if he's supposed to be kind of like the magician from Bad Hair Day, or like a reinvention of him. But Mondo is having a bad day while being a magician. He's told the kids that his entire act was the worst performance he's ever given. And sometimes the magic spirits are against the magician's favor. And he's talking to Jessica and Ryan, and Jessica kind of reveals to Mondo that her father is a magician. And Mondo is intrigued and was like, well, why don't we try to pick out something so you can take home to your father? So Jessica and Ryan are looking at this item that looks like to be a coffin, and Mondo decides to, because the kids keep poking at him with like magic knowledge, he's like, you know what, I'll give you a little taste. Why don't Ryan, you hop in this coffin and I'll show you how this thing works. And the kids seem honored, and Ryan hops in the coffin and Mondo says a spell, and then when the coffin opens, Ryan's gone. And Jessica thinks that this is a great trick, and Mondo's acting all serious like Ryan actually disappeared. And then once the situation starts to become relevant and, you know, real for Jessica, she's like, oh, Ryan did disappear. And Mondo is like, it's just not my day. And Jessica's like, well, I'll go in the box, do the same thing you did to Ryan, I'll go try to find where Ryan went. So Jessica gets put into this dark room, feels like she's sliding down this slide, and she's in this tunnel of darkness, and she sees a faint dim of light, and she walks to that light, and she ends up finding her friend Ryan, and Ryan is mystified while they're there and what this place is, and they realize they're in the back of this shop. So they enter through this door, and they see all these like souvenirs and stuff, and they're like, oh, this must be a souvenir shop. And it's revealed from this old guy who looks like Benjamin Franklin named Jonathan Schiller that this is a souvenir shop, and that the kids should take home a souvenir to remember the place. And Jessica finds this coin with gold coin with two heads on both sides, and she thinks it's a cool trick coin. So this is the coin she wants to bring home. She thinks it'll be a fun magic trick to play on people. And Jonathan Schiller kind of drops a nod, saying that it's also good for waging bets and stuff. So Jonathan wraps up the present, gives her a little horror icon ornament thing to take home as well, and says, don't worry about paying me now, just pay me back the next time you see me. And Jessica's like, I don't know what you mean by that, but okay. So then it cuts into this after HorrorLand part, which is the rest of the story essentially, where Jessica's now at home, and she's opened the coin, and the coin has been around, and apparently her father has come into possession of the coin, and her father has been messing around with the coin and playing around with it, and tries to do the thing with Jessica saying, pick a side, heads or tails, and Jessica's like, well, I already know that both sides are heads, but he makes the coin land on its side, and she's like intrigued about that trick, and she wants to know more, but she's running late for school, and this is about a week after the whole HorrorLand thing has wrapped up. So she heads to school, and she sees her friend Ryan getting beat up by this guy named Boomer, who's this generic bully, who likes to pick on Ryan because, you know, he's a small little pipsqueak type. Ryan's described to kind of wear like all black clothing. He's kind of a weird kid and kind of scrawny. So he's the typical kind to get picked on by bigger kids with lower brain cells, like Boomer. So Boomer's beating him up, and Jessica tries to make a deal with him, saying, if I flip a coin, you know, you gotta leave Ryan alone, and if it lands on the side that I pick, you gotta honor it, and if it lands on the side you pick, on the other side, then we'll do whatever you want. Boomer's like, okay, so Jessica flips the coin, and it lands on heads, and that's the side she called, and of course, this enrages Boomer, who demands a reflip. And as this happens, a situation happens where the coin kind of falls, and the kids are trying to get the coin back, and they both touch the coin, which sends them both spiraling, quite literally, in time and space. And when they come to, they realize they're in an open field where before they were just outside their school, about to go inside school with Boomer. And now they're in this open field with nobody around, no school in sight, no houses or anything. And all they see are these big, giant walls. And they have to find a way to figure out where they're at. So they enter these walls and they see a bunch of these huts with like straw and mud. And then they see this giant castle. And they're like, well, this is weird. This was not here before. And they still haven't put together that they've traveled back in time. And they're also still wearing their 21st century clothing. So immediately, while they're entering this town, they come across this blacksmith guy who is, kind of creepy looking. And they ask him where they're at. And the executioner, not the executioner, but the blacksmith guy is like, you should know where you're at. You're at a castle. This is the prince's castle. And he thinks that something's up with these kids. And these kids might be disguised assassins because something has happened to the prince we don't know yet. But he starts calling the guards and the kids get kind of alarmed to start running. And then they get captured by these guards. And essentially, they're told that they are the assassins of the prince, and they're going to be taken before the prince to get their, judgment put onto them and to see what their fate bestows them. And the kids are like, we didn't do anything, and they keep trying to plead their innocence. And while they're getting taken by these guards, they meet this wizard guy, and I forget his name. I think it's Henway. That's his name, Henway the Wizard. And then there's this Duke of Earl person whose real name is Albert. And these two buffoonish type of guys are kind of like the prince's right-hand men. And they are pretty much claiming that they are the assassins. And the kids are like, well, if you can't convince them, we got to convince the prince himself. And then they start to realize, well, if the prince was assassinated, then how was he alive? And then when they finally meet the prince, there's a graphic scene of them describing of how the prince is headless, and there's like scars and decayed tissue where his head used to be, and the prince is just pretty much a moving body. And it's kind of insinuated that the prince has a lot of magic that kind of precedes Henway the magician's powers, and he can keep himself alive without a head. And they're trying to figure out what happened to his head. And the prince is writing on this parchment paper with one of those old scribe pens. And he's like, where'd you put my head? Where'd you hide my head? And he keeps asking the kids, keeps pointing to the question and making it more, tense. And the kid's like, we didn't do nothing with your head. And then finally, the prince has him sent down to the dungeon to be essentially executed for, decapitating him and putting his head somewhere. So the kids are baffled. They're taken down to the dungeon. They're put in the dungeon only after they were essentially going to be executed, right? So what happened was they were taken to the top of the castle where they were about to be executed, and they had the gold coin from earlier. And Jessica tries to barter with the Duke of Earl guy who has a gambling addiction for some reason. And she correctly calls heads, because both sides of the coin are heads. And the Duke has to honor his, word. So they send him down to the dungeon to not execute them, but they haven't decided what they're going to do yet. Now, mind you, all this takes place in one day. Everything in this story I'm about to go over takes place in one day, so it's going to be kind of hard to keep up. So now they're back in the dungeon. They have some eerie interactions with some dungeon people down there. And the kids are like, we got to get out of here. We got to find out how we got here in the first place. We're obviously traveled back in time. Maybe we just tell them we traveled back in time. This was a misunderstanding. And we just keep at it. And maybe try to find a way out of the castle. We can end back up where we were before, and we can find a way out of here. So the kids try just that. So they had a bunch of magic training that was hinted on in the beginning of the story. So when the guards came down, somehow Ryan had pickpocketed some keys, and they opened up the dungeon door, and they were trying to escape, but all the commotion from the other dungeon people got back to the guards, and the guards saw the kids just against the prison door after the door shut behind them and locked, and the keys they left inside the cell, so they couldn't get back in there. So obviously they were caught red-handed. But then Jessica uses her ventriloquist abilities to kind of psych out the guard, and they run off and escape down this tunnel where they're able to find a room with a bunch of spare robes, and they change out of their 21st century clothes into robes, and they climb this ladder and escape out of a window, and they run and try to figure out the next order of business. So they try to talk it over, and they're like, well, let's try touching the coin at the same time, and it doesn't work. So they're like, maybe we're here for a purpose. Maybe we were sent here to help the prince find his head. So they go on this scavenger hunt to find the prince's head, to try to make amends with the prince, to kind of prove to them that they weren't the assassins, and maybe they can go home as a result. So they start searching these hut things around the castle, and they find this hut owned by this man named Simon that's full of rats. And what's really creepy about the scene is how Simon's depicted and how all the rats, it's just really creepy to think about. But they essentially go inside of this hut and with these robes on, and they're trying to find maybe where the prince's head was hidden. And Simon comes in and reveals that this hut is this place of rat keeping. It's like a rat keeping hut for the prince's 500 something cats. So the kids are like, that's weird. And they get all these rats climbing on them. And then Ryan stumbles across a head that's buried in one of the straw. So they pick up the head and they decide to, no, that's not what happened. I'm getting way ahead of myself. So they escape there, and then they go to the guy beforehand, the blacksmith's hut, and that's where they find the head, and that's where they find the prince's head, supposedly, the first time. And the blacksmith, after they escape the hut, they have a couple of rats still on them, and the rats escape. The blacksmith wants to kill the kids, but the rats escape and scares the horses that the blacksmith was building horseshoes for early on in the scene. And these horses start running off, which distracts the blacksmith. And now, since they have this head from the hut, they want to purposely get captured again to get taken to the prince and show the prince that they found the head. And they do just that. They get taken straight to the prince with the head. And when the prince feels around the head, he's like, "This isn't my head. You're trying to mess with me. I always kill my opponents. You guys are playing mind games. You guys deserve to be put to death. I'm going to send you to the dungeon." So the kids are, of course, attempted to be sent through the dungeon. But during this, there's a bunch of commotion going on where the kids are like, all right, we have an opportunity to escape. So they escape via hiding behind this curtain. And then they put two and two together like, hey, look, we've been taken all up and down this castle today. We haven't seen a single cat. If the prince has 500 cats, wouldn't you think the story about the cats would be true from the Simon the Rat guy? They put two and two together, and they think that Simon was lying. So then they try to escape the castle again and go back to the rat hut because they think that that's the place where they'll find answers. And essentially they go back to Simon's hut, and they break in with all the rats, and they find a duffel with the head in it, and they have to find a way to escape Simon's house, which they do. And then they end up being taken back to the castle, but this time they're taken by Henway the Wizard and the Duke of Earl, named Albert. And the kids are trying to wager with them to not be taken to the dungeon. And then this big old reveal happens about the head duffel, the trick coin, and all of this. And there's a big revelation that happens. And I don't want to spoil what happens, but essentially, the prince may or may not have caught wind of this conversation that was happening, this whole conspiracy, potentially, that was being discussed here. And there's a really graphic scene dealing with the prince. And essentially, the kids, Jessica and Ryan, may or may not get out of the situation. Like I say, may or may not. And may or may not end up back in the situation they were before, albeit dumbfounded and kind of played at the same time. And the ending kind of leaves it kind of whatever for them, as their fate, in their own time is kind of back-ended a little bit. If they do make it into their own time. I want to keep it as vague as possible. And then there's an epilogue that kind of ties Jessica and Jonathan Chiller, back to the first part of the story where, she had the coin and the souvenir trinket from the HorrorLand. And there's a big revelation by what Chiller meant when he talked to Jessica and Ryan, and that's where the story ends, essentially. And that is Heads You Lose in a nutshell. So, yeah, off the bat, I think this book, I don't know if I stated it or maybe understated it in the Potter review, but this book had a lot of wild scenes that were really graphic and dark for a Goosebumps story. And I really appreciated the imagery and the prowess this book had. The experiences of Jessica and Ryan came off very hectic, very in the moment, very sudden. It had a lot of stakes to them. Their lives were in danger. Their lives as they knew it from the present day was in jeopardy. And nobody believed them. So they had to go throughout the story with the deck stacked against them. But they were given these basically conditioned skills that they learned off page of the story. And they were able to use these skills that most of the people of the time that they traveled to did not know of. Like ventriloquist talk and misdirection and simple magic tricks like that went over a lot of these people's heads, and they were able to get themselves out of a lot of sticky situations than most Goosebumps protagonists would do. And I quite find that refreshing, because not a lot of the times you see operant conditioning done well in Goosebumps. Most of the time you have like a horror fan that's seen a lot of horror movies, and their operant conditioning still doesn't really help them in the story. But very, very rarely do skills of characters that are hinted at that they learned, off page way before the story happened, that they utilize and use well in the story to help save them. So that was kind of refreshing to see with Jessica and Ryan. And I really got some enjoyment out of that. It felt different than your average Goosebumps book in that regard. And also, I think the premise with the scavenger hunt was really fun. It's a callback to the Headless Ghost. And I think the build-up here was a lot more... it had a lot more fun moments, a lot more scarier moments than the Headless Ghost did. Even though the Headless Ghost was trying to build more of the urban legend and the old wise tales aspect to it, while this story didn't have that, it did have that medieval note and did have that dirty and just, I don't know how to put this. It just made you, the way the story went, it made you feel itchy and dirty, and it made you feel unsettled in a lot of the best ways as the story was unfolding. And the whole prince setup in the scavenger hunt aspect to the story, even though the story takes place all in one day, it felt very stake filled. It felt like it had purpose for the characters being there. And that also is another refreshing thing about this book, is that ultimately the whole adventure for these characters had a tremendous purpose, kind of tying to A Night in Terror Tower now. And I can definitely see why this book is viewed as a blending of the Headless Ghost and A Night in Terror Tower. As in A Night in Terror Tower, they traveled back in time for sort of a purpose, because that's where they originated from, and that's where they have to deal with the Lord High Executioner, and their purpose is to still come out alive, right? Well, the purpose in this story is, it comes across as this coin has taken them back in time to the specific area and the specific land to help this prince. And and the characters understand that purpose, and they're very open about that purpose to the reader. And it makes it come across like not an all-for-nothing story, and they're there for a reason. Now, what the reason is, it's never really expressed. Did Chiller send them there to try to mess with them? Who knows? Did they get sent there because they're the ones that the prince thought could help? I don't know. It's never really addressed, but there is some resemblance of a purpose there. And that also goes without saying, going back to the dark stuff that this book includes, there's a lot of darkness to this book and a lot of dark humor as well. And the ironic humor to it all really lands, and there's some really genuinely funny moments and genuinely creepy moments at the same time. And I was genuinely scared when that whole prince revelation happened, when they discovered that this prince was headless. The graphic imagery there really worked. And yeah, it was a really fun atmosphere. The castle setting was fine. It was fun. It was just a fun read. It was fast paced. It was lightning quick. You didn't need to take breaks. It was just quick and over with. But where some of those positives kind of bleed into more negatives for me, I do kind of take issue with a couple things here. And it's one of those books that I can't explain why they're kind of positives and negatives at the same time, but they are. The pacing of this book just feels a little too rushed in hindsight for me. I feel like a lot of the exploration was condensed down to chase scenes, and it falls into the same trappings that A Night in Terror Tower had with these chase scenes. And yeah, I know the whole story takes place in one day, and I could be more forgiving on that, but it's just, it's barreling fast, barreling through the story, running from place to place. And the scenery, you don't really feel like you get to take it all in, you know? And that's something that I wish this book was. Same issue with The Night in Terror Tower. I just wish it was more expansive with its imagery and not as fast-paced with these chase scenes that just make the book kind of repetitive. And also, where this location is, this castle area, I mean, the kids are said to live in Tampa, Florida, right? And they go back in time, and they do all this flipping and turning through time, and they're taken to this place, but it's never established where this place is. There's a Duke of Earl. Maybe it takes place in this town called Earl, but where is Earl? Is Earl in Europe? Is Earl in North America? Where is this place? The location is completely skimmed over, and it's kind of hard to imagine where exactly, on a historical perspective, where to place these kids and what time zone. It's implied to be medieval times because there's a castle and guards and a prince, but it's never really explicitly said what time period it is. And it's just kind of frustrating on that element. You know, things that you would think would be included just aren't included. And vagueness where it doesn't need to be vague kind of bugs me. And then on top of that, the ending. The ending to me is very... The way it ends is just whatever. I mean, you go through this whole experience with these characters, and then they end up where they do at the end, and it feels like they still are getting the short end of the stick. And somehow they still are losers in the situation. Which I don't mind, but, you know, I don't know why the book had to end on that note. I kind of wish that it went a little further than just, you know, a practical joke being played. Like, the whole entire twist of this story is kind of like a practical joke from The Prince. When you think about it, if you read it, you know what I'm talking about. And that, to me, is just kind of frustrating and just unnecessary to end the story there. I would definitely pick a different direction to end on. That just made me feel whatever by the end of the story. And kind of detracts the experience I did have, the good experiences I did have while reading the book. So, yeah, I did have my issues with it. So from a 0 to 5 star basis, I was on the fence whether to give this book an A or a B. And I kind of decided against an A because I think this book just doesn't quite hit that 4.5 or higher mark I'm looking for. But I do think it deserves a B. And where I settled on this is kind of surprising. I deducted... with the pacing, it's not the greatest pacing, but it's not the worst. And the ending is kind of whatever, but it's not terrible. And since, you know, the whole vagueness about where they are is not really all that important, but kind of unnecessarily vague, they were all small to little medium things, and they kind of added up to be about 0.8 deducted. And I gave this book a 4.2 out of 5, which I think is about a 0.1 step up for both The Headless Ghost and A Night in Terror Tower for me. Do I think this book is leaps and bounds better? No. I think this book is about on par with those both, unfortunately. I think this book has some problems that just add up as well. And it's not as great as other people made it out to me to sound. But I still do recommend it. I still do think this would be a great modern book to pick up. And yeah, so a 4.2 out of 5 is about a B for me. I think that's what it deserves. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Heads You Lose. Let me know down in the comment section if you ever read this book. Do you love this or do you hate this? I'm dying to know, and I'll see you next time.